Hi everybody. You can't see me, but you can hear me. We are back for the third and final installment for enharmonic modulation. Um, I'm hoping that you can see enough of this for this to make sense. I'm on page 412 in your textbook. I want to look at the short modulating chorales. These are assignments that I also gave you in the written letter that I've sort of spelled out what we're going to be doing this week. And I want to look closely at number 1 and number 3. So I think a good strategy when you're trying to work through these relatively short enharmonic modulation excerpts are, first of all, 3 steps. What key are you starting in? What key are you winding up in? And then somewhere roughly, very roughly in the middle, look for the usual suspect. And by the usual suspect, I mean you can't do this enharmonic modulation with any chord. It must be, at least for the material that we're going to be using in this book, it must be a fully diminished 7th chord, or it must be a dominant 7th chord, or it must be a German augmented 6th. Those are the usual suspects. If you're starting with a fully diminished 7th chord, what's going to happen when you enharmonically respell it is it's still going to be a fully diminished 7th chord, but it will appear to have a different root. If you're starting with a dominant 7th chord, it will sound the same, but its appearance will change into that of a German augmented 6th. So dominant 7th, German augmented 6th, those two go together, and some fully diminished 7th chord changing into some other fully diminished 7th chord, those two go together. And those are the only usual suspects. So for number 1, we're starting off in the key of 4 sharps. I've already gone through this one, but let's just see how this fits into that strategy. 4 sharps is going to either be E major or C sharp minor. The very first chord I see is an E major chord. After that, I've got an ordinary Roman numeral 7 chord in the key of E, so E major it is. What I would suggest you do is maybe do the first few, 2, 3, 4 chords in the original key. So I've got a 1 chord. Then I've got a D sharp fully diminished 7th chord in root position. That's Roman numeral 7, 7. It goes right back to 1. It behaves like a normal 7 chord. Then that goes to this chord. We're now in the 3rd full measure. This chord is spelled B, D sharp, F sharp, and A. It's in 2nd inversion, so it's a B dominant 7th chord. That's a 5 chord in the key of E, so it's a 5, 4, 3. Let's stop there. Okay? So we've only done part of it. Now let's go to the end and see what key we wind up in. And very often that's quite clear if you look at the last 2 chords. I've got a D dominant 7th chord, D, F sharp, A, C. That's a 5, 7, and then the 5, 7 goes to 1, G, B, D. So now I'm in the key of G. I can maybe back up a little bit more. I see another G major chord here. So in the new key of G major, I've got 1, 5, 7, 1. If I go back even one more before that, I've got a chord with D, F sharp, A, C. That's still just a regular 5, 7 chord in the key of G. So this last bit of it is just 5, 1, 5, 1 in G. The first bit of it is 1, 7, 1, 5 in the key of E. Okay, so now let's complete the rest of it, and let's be on the lookout for a usual suspect. We're looking either for a fully diminished 7th chord, or for a dominant 7th chord, or for a German augmented 6, somewhere in the middle. And right here, I've got a chord spelled, there's an E flat, there's a C, there's an F sharp, and there's an A. So that's not in root position, but if it was in root position, that chord would be spelled F sharp, A, C, and E flat. And that's a fully diminished 7th chord. So that's going to be my usual suspect. So this chord goes to a 1, 6. And here's how this works. We look at the chord that we've identified as the usual suspect. And let's say, okay, so the way it's spelled, it looks like an F sharp fully diminished 7th chord. Is there an F sharp fully diminished 7th chord in the key of G? Yes, there is. If I was in the key of G, and G is where I wind up, this F sharp fully diminished 7th chord is going to be Roman numeral 7, and that's just going to get me into G. But this is also a pivot chord. What was the note that changed? Over here we have the same chord. The only difference between the chord here and the chord here is that D sharp has been exchanged for E flat. Now they sound the same, but when you change those two notes out, that changes what the root of the chord must be. So back here, the only way I can make a stack of thirds is by spelling this chord D sharp, F sharp, A, and C, and that makes it a 7 chord in the key of E. But when I get rid of the D sharp and change it to an E flat, now the only way I can make a root position looking stack of thirds is by spelling the chord F sharp, A, C, and E flat. So D sharp over here is the root of the chord, but when I change D sharp into E flat, that's not the root anymore. Now E flat has got to be the 7th because F sharp is the root. So back here, when D sharp is the root and it's a Roman numeral 7 chord, D sharp goes to E, 7 goes to 1. Over here, with that spelling, now F sharp is the root and F sharp goes to G. 7 still goes to 1, but now F sharp goes to G and 1 is G. Back here, D sharp goes to E and 1 is E. So the way to write this up as Roman numerals, this is a pivot chord, we ask ourselves, suppose I didn't make the change. Suppose I kept my D sharp, and instead of a D sharp on the bottom, or instead of an E flat on the bottom, I've got a D sharp on the bottom. Then in the key that I started with, E, that would just be a Roman numeral 7 chord. Okay? But in fact, we did change the D sharp into an E flat. So now let's look at the chord one more time, but this time with the E flat. Now the chord is going to be spelled F sharp, A, C, and E flat. It's not in root position anymore. So the root of the chord, when I've got E flat in there, is F sharp, and that means now it's a 7 in G, but now it's in 4/2 inversion. So if that was D sharp, that would be a root position chord. But once I lose the D sharp and change it to E flat becomes the 7th. So now I've got the 7th in the bass. That's the same thing as 3rd inversion. And then I've got a chord spelled F sharp, A, C, and E flat. So if I change the spelling down here, I could make this chord once again look like a chord in E. But then it would have to stay in the key of E. Once I change the spelling, now this looks like a chord whose root is F sharp, and that's a 7 of G. And from this point on, the progression changes its orientation, and I just head towards G, whereas back here I was in the key of E. Now, I'm going to let you work out the details on number 2, but I've already started it. I've got a key signature of 3 flats. So 3 flats is either C minor or E flat major. The very first chord is a C minor chord. Here's a G dominant 7th chord. That's a 5/4/2. So we're in the key of C minor. There's a 1/6. So there's the first few chords in C. Second step is we know it's going to change keys. So let's look at where we wind up. If I look at the last 2 chords, the second last chord is a root position B dominant 7th. There's a B, there's a D sharp that's still sounding. And then I've got an A, so the 5th of the chord has been left out. That's okay. It's a B dominant 7th chord. That's a 5/7 in the key of E, and it goes to E. So I start off in the key of C minor. I wind up in the key of E minor. What you need to do next is somewhere in the middle of this, look for one of the usual suspects. And that's going to be your pivot chord. And again, there are only 3 possible usual suspects. Either it's going to be a fully diminished 7th chord that gets respelled as a different fully diminished 7th chord, or it's going to be a dominant 7th chord that gets respelled as a German augmented 6th, or the exact opposite, a German augmented 6th that gets respelled as a dominant 7th chord. Let's do one more. I've done this one all the way through. Now in the bottom, I've got a key signature of 2 sharps. 2 sharps is going to either be D major or it's going to be B minor. If I look at the first few chords, I start right off with a D major chord. So I'm in the key of D major. There's a 1 chord, there's a 3 chord, there's a 4 chord, then I get back to the 1 chord, then there's a 5 chord, then there is another 1 chord. So that's all the D major stuff. But we know it's going to change keys. So let's see where the key change puts us. If I look at the very last chord, there's an F sharp minor chord. And if I look at the chord just before that, I've got a chord spelled C sharp. There's an E sharp. There's a G sharp. And then I pick up a B. So like that's a 5/7 chord in the key of F sharp. So the second part of this, the new key, is the key of F sharp minor, even though we started off in the key of D major. So now we're looking for one of the usual suspects. And the usual suspect in this case shows up on the 4th beat. Here are all the notes I've got lined up. So it's a little bit hard to see because some of the notes are holding on. But I've got a D. Up here in the soprano, I've got an F sharp. In the tenor, I've got an A. And then at the very end in the alto, I pick up a C. So that altogether is D, F sharp, A, C natural. That's a dominant 7th chord. Now ordinarily, D, F sharp, A, C natural should put us in the key of G, but that's not what happens. So let's go back and reconsider this chord. Remember, when you change a dominant 7th chord into a German augmented 6th, you only change one note. You change the 7th. You change it into its enharmonic, version that sounds the same. So instead of D, F sharp, A, and C, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reimagine that C as the note that sounds just exactly the same, B sharp. B sharp and C sound similar. So down here I just made a few notes. I hope you can see them. But if I spell it D, F sharp, A, C, that's a dominant 7th of G. If I stayed in the key of D major, maybe it would be a secondary dominant. But if I look at that one note, the 7th, C, I notice that I can respell it as B sharp. It'll sound just the same, but it will look different. Then my chord will be spelled D, F sharp, A, B natural, or B sharp rather. D, F sharp, A, B sharp. And that chord is now a German augmented 6th chord. The way German augmented 6th chords work is the B sharp is going to go to C sharp, the D is going to go down to C sharp is 5, and we're in the key of F sharp. So the usual suspect here was actually on the 3rd and the 4th beat. I had to wait till the 4th beat to get the C, and then that C, the way the whole thing worked is it was as though the C had been respelled to B sharp, and then B sharp resolved to C sharp, and from that point on we stayed in the key of F sharp minor. So in the old key, this chord would look like a secondary dominant, but when I understand that what really happened is the C natural is behaving like B sharp, at the same time the chord behaves like a German augmented 6th. So it might have been this, but in fact it was actually that. And then I stay in the key of F sharp minor. I look forward to speaking to you over the course of the week. I have office hours. Please check the revised course outline and also check the specific course agenda for this week. And I'm hoping this is helpful, but I am really looking forward to speaking to you one-on-one in real time and just sort of figuring out what makes sense and what doesn't make sense and trying to work to have all of it make sense. So I'll be speaking to you soon, and I hope you're all very well. Bye-bye.